Back early from the tea and coffee break, and looking forward to sharing some thoughts on broadly what is going on in academia, particularly in the US, and which is really the source. So if you think there are problems in Indian academia and what is being taught by esteemed professors here, I want to talk a little bit today about the dominant paradigm in the humanities and social sciences. What exactly are the professors, the scholars, the students? Now increasingly there are more and more students from India who are going into these fields, not just computers and medicine. They're going to media studies and history and all these other subjects. What exactly are they learning? And more importantly, why are they learning it? Why is the story the way it, in the shape that it is? And I think that's very important because what is happening right now is incredible. We have a partnership, a friendship, an alliance, a messy one, a dysfunctional one sometimes, but essentially what we are witnessing is a storming of the Bastille, or I don't know what our Indian equivalent of that would be, but it's a democratic movement where the ivory tower is being questioned, increasingly by non-professional scholars, by lay scholars, people who just care about truth, who care about knowledge. They may have their degrees in IT and other fields, but they're taking an interest, they're asking questions on why a certain truth claim is being made the way it is. And I think there are more and more efforts being made, and this forum has been a wonderful one, where there's this kind of a conversation between people who are in academia, who are sort of coming into academia, like the many young students we saw the last couple of days, and some very, very influential and intelligent bloggers, social media warriors. So it's a time of great change, nothing short of that. But it's also a time of tremendous challenges because, if you just recollect some of the questions that were asked, I think several times, particularly yesterday to Amit Shahji by the lady who was sitting there and somebody else, it is challenging because many of us ended up writing about some of these issues because they were dear to our heart, not for fame, not for economic incentive, and quite the opposite also happens. That we face severe professional and social challenges for espousing the kind of views we do. And what we are saying, frankly, is for the most part, very fair. It's reasonable. It's based on logic, and it comes from a good place in the heart. I'm going to speak a lot about good places in the heart. I think it's very important in order to decolonize the kind of dominant narrative there is. So this, I think, is a very important gathering. Just a quick question. I just want to get a sense, how many of the members in the room right now are in college or are professors or are students? Could you just raise your hands? Very good. Thank you. So, and how many of you are in like humanities or social sciences and so on? Fantastic. India is free. Okay. Oh, that gives me hope. Okay. Wonderful. Okay. So I want to talk broadly about three things today. The first, point briefly I want to talk about is the dominant paradigm on India. So, and it's very influential. It's not just in the US. It's gone global. So essentially, why is the India story the way it is? And I know we have our own narratives, particularly some of us who were exposed, I think, to the literature of resistance, also known as saffron literature. I began to discover it very, very recently. I would say only from the time this book came out, and I discovered there's a vast world of knowledge out there which I didn't even know about till now. But anyway, so some of us have known for quite a while there's a problem, but it's important to address this problem within the logic of how academia is structured today. So I think we're at least one generation away before we have an Indic knowledge system or everything is decolonized or an Indic media system. So we are in a way a bridge cohort, a bridge in time between a lingering, festering colonialism and hopefully a free India and a free world, because I think without a free India, a free world is impossible, and it's just a fact historically. So the first point I want to talk about briefly is the dominant paradigm. The second one is a case study in the dominant paradigm, which we actually fought off and won. Doesn't happen very often. We took a lot of bruises, but anyway, so I want to talk specifically about the California textbooks issue, where, as some of you might have heard, they pretty much decided that India didn't exist and Hinduism didn't exist, except casteism. That existed all the time, and we were irredeemably evil. Anyway, so we fought off a very powerful academic and then a media assault on just a few of us really who thought the way the India story was being told in the textbooks was absurd, and what the researchers and the professors, the top scholars, the big brand names were saying was also absurd. So we had to fight it off in a very precise way, which, and I'll talk briefly about that. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about, just some general suggestions, on where I think the paradigm could go, what are the ideas, and then a little bit about the craft and spirit of writing, again, from a good place in the heart. I think we are here because words are our friends, simple as that. And I think we need to restore and remember our relationship to words and, of course, images or gifs or code or whatever else it is. But fundamentally, we come from a civilization that respects enormously, the power of the word, the beauty of the word, and the great social investment that goes into communication. And in these days of Twitter, and I never realized Twitter rhymes with fritter, but that's what it is. I mean, there's a lot of frittering of energy and also sometimes of political capital, which we are building up, very, very assiduously here. So finally, that's the third point, a little bit about writing, and then I look forward to some questions from you. And I particularly would like to invite those of you here to share a little bit about your encounter with the dominant paradigm in India and where you see yourself going as scholars and writers. So the first point, the dominant paradigm in academia. So I've talked about some of these issues in a couple of chapters in my book, and I'm taking it for granted many of you have read it, and that's a great feeling, thank you. If you've not, I have a couple of copies free for students, nominal cost for non-students, because the publisher stopped giving me free copies since there's a lot of demand for it. Anyway, I've written about it in Rearming Hinduism, but I'll just briefly recap it. So, right now the paradigm that we are living in, whether you study media or cultural studies or anthropology or religion, history, any of these fields anywhere in the world, the dominant paradigm today sounds really good. Okay, it is the place for idealists, for dreamers, for people who feel pain at the pain of other human beings, animals, the environment. In principle, it's a great paradigm, it's a critical paradigm. It emerged as a protest, as a counterpoint to great oppression and tyranny and violence and war in the world. That is a fact. But unfortunately, the way the India story is playing out, and I'm not just saying this because we're Indians and we've got to be proud or fight for us tribalistically. I'm saying it because we are 1/6 of humanity, and we have a history of having influenced much of the world, whether we like it or not. To paraphrase that famous Malcolm X dialogue, we didn't go looking to spread Hinduism, they just came and took it from us, or something like that. So we've played a role in history, whether it's the influence of India in Asia or the discovery of America by Columbus looking for India. So we have a role to play in the world, and it's good because civilizationally our philosophy is equipped to deal with diversity, to deal with nature, to deal with a lot of these questions. Now, unfortunately, today's dominant paradigm, which has questioned oppression and racism and imperialism and war in the Western context in a good way, has turned out to be the face of the same old system of oppression and injustice and war and tyranny as far as we are concerned. So the logical question for us to think about is if they keep getting us wrong, how soon before they get everything else wrong? So this need, I think, for academic decolonization, which all of you are participating in several ways, has both a self-serving or a self-protecting need for our future generations and for the country, but also for a universalistic goal. I just want to emphasize that. So how did this academic paradigm emerge, and where is it today? So till the 1960s or so, mainly in the 50s and 60s, which is when American academia boomed and the social sciences boomed, the old dominant paradigm was sort of a remnant of the earlier colonial way of thinking. Now, on the good side, they believed in scientific rigor, they believed in a universal approach. So the researchers used to go in and believe that if you were scientific and objective enough, you could discover the truth about human societies the same way they did in chemistry labs or physics labs and so on. So they did some useful things, but then they did a lot of problematic things because human society is diverse, it's a living thing. Plus, colonialism had warped the way they thought about the world. So very influential books like Edward Said's Orientalism, Samir Amin's Eurocentrism, several books that came out in the 60s and 70s challenged the old narrative. How to Read Donald Duck, a very Marxist pamphlet, but a delightful book to read. We all should read it, especially if you grew up with Uncle Scrooge comics or whatever. So this is a great tradition of critical literature, which is very useful for us to understand the old dominant paradigm of imperialism, capitalism, call it what you will. So in the 50s and 60s, the social sciences pretty much were dominated by essentially a Western, normative capitalist point of view, call it what you will. So what they did was they justified wars. You know, the Pentagon funded a lot of academia during the Cold War. They even funded creative writer programs that's coming out now. So the Western academia was pretty much part of the war machine and the part of the racist machine. 60s and 70s, there was a big upheaval all around the world, but particularly in the university campuses. There were protests against the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, all these things, revolutions happened. And initially, in some ways, they obviously changed academia for the better. Because students would go and say, why are the professors teaching us this colonial stuff about everybody else being inferior? Why are you not practicing equality? I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but things like that. So 60s and 70s, what happened essentially is that a paradigm shift took place in the social sciences and humanities. And universities responded essentially by giving students classes they liked to take. So there were classes on Black studies, African American literature, women's literature, Latino literature, and slowly a new organizational logic began to proliferate in academia. So you saw the rise of ethnic studies, Black studies, women's studies, all these different kinds of interdisciplinary programs where a professor could be in, say, sociology or history, but would also be housed in one of these area studies or identity studies programs. And they were useful to the extent that they gave a voice to previously marginalized communities. And, they played a good role. But where something really strange happened was that area studies, and particularly South Asia studies, which is where technically there is 1 billion of us were supposed to get represented, did. South Asia studies went off in a very, very different direction, and it plays out in every field. For example, in my field of media studies, I was stunned, and I was talking to Professor Charu Uppal this morning, to find that there's not a single study of how India, forget Hinduism, even India is misrepresented in the history of Hollywood or Western news reporting. There are dozens of books on how Arabs are misrepresented, on how Asians and Japanese and Mexicans and everybody's misrepresented. And I know there's like dozens, if not hundreds, of Indian origin scholars in my field. None of us saw it ever fit to study how India is being stereotyped in movies like, Slumdog Millionaire or whatever. So there's a huge paucity in the social sciences when it comes to the India story. Now, one thing, before I just go to the California examples, one point I want to make which is important to remember. The South Asia studies paradigm also emerged within this context of a critical approach. Okay, so South Asia Studies scholars also came in saying we want to critique power, we want to fight colonialism and imperialism and racism and sexism and all these things, which is good. Now where things kind of got weird is, I'll illustrate it in the following manner. So now, let's say in a big American university, you have a women's studies program and a black studies program and a South Asia studies program. Now, in the women's studies program, you have professors and you have classes and you have students and publications all fighting patriarchy. Sometimes it can just be men as a whole, but at least in principle, the fight is against patriarchy, a system of oppression where women suffer. Fair enough. Now, in the Black Studies program, similarly, you have the professors and students and the whole scholarship focusing on a particular racist formation, let's call it white supremacism or racism. I mean, these are oppressive realities which they fight, they study and fight and try to empower the people in these groups. Now, when it comes to South Asia studies, and I'm broadly going to just include Hinduism and religious studies also in that category. It's not exactly the same, it's come from a different weird lineage, but when it comes to essentially any kind of scholarship or teaching on India, for some reason, the bad guy in the story, to put it in simple terms, is not 500 years of colonialism or racism which we've all faced, which India has faced, but ourselves. So in Hinduism studies, the object of critique is not Hinduphobia or normative anti-Hindu fanaticism, which is what I'm starting to call it these days. Hinduphobia is too mild a word. Normative anti-Hindu fanaticism. The scholars don't fight that. They say it doesn't even exist. They say the problem is with Hinduism, with India. So this is a weird thing. And for 20, 30 years, this replicated itself. It was there in the US, it was here in the Indian campuses, it's gone back and forth, and I would say from the 1990s it has boomed. So what used to be thought of as radical stuff that your hippie friends in JNU or UMass or somewhere else talked about is today mainstream in India. And since you are at the front line of a cultural and civilizational, intellectual, spiritual struggle, you should be very clear in your understanding of that as writers. You cannot call these people fringe groups anymore. In a way they are, but at the moment if you call them that, it doesn't stick. I mean, not when they write letters with Berkeley and Stanford and Harvard on their letterhead, right? So, understanding the terrain is important. So this has gone mainstream, it's become a lifestyle thing. Now in the 90s, I'll give you an example when a famous filmmaker from India, I don't know whether he would be happy if I used the word India, say from South Asia, came and screened a film on Ayodhya in my university. There were 20, 30 people who came. I would say about 7, 8 people were his supporters, maybe about 10 to 15 Indians, mostly from engineering, MBA, were there to ask him tough questions, and a few people in between. Today, I think the situation is very different. The people who might question, the dominant narrative on Ayodhya or secularism or Hinduism or Narendra Modi ji or whatever, are going to feel like a minority, at least in elite circles and intellectual circles. So that's something we need to be aware of. So in 20 years, things have gone, the radical has gone mainstream. So that is something which is good. It's a fight. We are fighting from a position of not being privileged, but we are fighting for the people. And in the previous talk today, which Arvindan ji spoke about Dr. Ambedkar's thought, it was so brilliant. It clarified so much for us. We are on the side of the people, and that is something we should remember as we go forward. So that's just a little bit about the dominant paradigm. So that is the problem. The dominant paradigm, supposedly in India Hinduism studies, which should be fighting for us, has made us the bad guys. Okay, so how does it play out in real life? So the California textbooks issue. So this sort of hit the news about 10 years ago in 2005, because until then I think most of us in America were used to privately complaining a little bit, but then the idea always was, hey, why rock the boat? And anyway, we want our children to go into medicine or engineering. So what if it's history? It's just one lesson in 6th grade, big deal. Now, that was a story for 20, 30 years, and I've heard, cousins, aunties, uncles, they would say like, yeah, when this boy or girl was little, they would come back crying from school because the teacher said, your religion is evil, or worships devils, or burns women at the stake, or whatever, free for all it was. Finally, in 2005, a lot of parents got organized in California, and they, realized that there's a very democratic process. Community groups can offer comments, and the syllabus will be revised accordingly. And they realized that this was done by all the other community groups. So the lesson on history, which talked about Islam or Christianity or Judaism, was beautiful. It was very, very pleasant, and it was just good for young people. Now the lesson on Hinduism was based on a syllabus written, I think, in the 80s or something. It was full of just Aryan invasion theory and caste and not much else. So in 2005, when community groups asked for a change, initially the board said, yeah, bring a scholar. So they got Professor Shiva Vajpayee, who was a retired professor of history. And they made a lot of recommendations which would have made it probably on par with the other lessons. But then at the last minute, some well-known professors intervened. They don't produce knowledge anymore, they produce interventions. So, yeah. So they intervened with a petition or a letter with 100 signatures and a lot of labels like Hindu nationalist and saffronization, and BJP lost the elections in 2004, so they are now trying to capture power in California textbooks. I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, this gets more and more absurd the more you realize what these people were writing. So anyway, so once this intervention took place, so you had like, I think, 100 professors who were all anointed to be the experts, anointed within the logic of the American university system and media discourse. These are the guys who are supposed to speak for us, because if there's a problem, there's a controversy with, say, Latinos in the textbook or Filipinos in the textbook, the professors usually go and speak for them, and especially with Islamic history in the textbooks. The professors of Islamic studies usually go and speak for the community. Now, in this case, you had professors of Hinduism and Indian history and whatever South Asia studies, essentially launching an all-out attack on the parents of these school kids, calling them saffron this and saffron that. So in 2005, things changed a little bit. There were lawsuits, but ultimately not much changed. But then the community woke up and realized there was a problem, so several organizations got involved with it. So by the time the new review came around in 2014-15, given the usual Indian style, even though they say that this is all one huge sung conspiracy and all that, it's a mess. Like it's like the Indian cricket team. I don't follow cricket that much, but somehow things go wrong, and then suddenly when Kapil Dev hits 175, okay, that's how dated my knowledge is, but somebody steps up, one day it's X, one day it's Y, and somehow we pull off. We survive for another decade or another generation. So, in a way, this time was like that, but a little better than that. So, in the present review process, a lot of different groups. There was the Oberoi Foundation, scholars. Okay, so the Oberoi Foundation, mainly spearheaded by Acharya Arumuganatha Swami, from the Hinduism Today magazine in Hawaii. Meticulous, organized. He kept track of every single bit of paperwork. This is a bureaucratic fight, basically. He did that, then Professor Vajpayee, then the Hindu American Foundation, then HEF, and then Tushar Pandya and CaliforniaHindus.org. So a lot of people, some I guess with some some background, lots with no prior background, just coming together, offering suggestions. A lot of students started going to Sacramento. 12 to 14-year-old children. You'll see a lot of those on some of the websites like CaliforniaHindus.org. And this is the first time after 40 years of being privately rich and successful, Indians were speaking up in America on a matter that really, really concerned them. Now, of course, there was a slight difference of view. I thought this should be approached as a pan-Indian problem because it was an ancient India curriculum. But given the logic of how religious identity plays out in America, I think most of the Indian groups organized as Hindus, Hindu Americans and so on, because that's just how America sees the world, Our secularists think that, it's all secular and all that, but America still sees the world in religious terms, no matter how irreligious or secular they may be at some level. So anyway, so different groups making often contradictory suggestions, some good, some weird, some that could be used against them in the court of, media trial, whatever. Then, actually, can we see the first, slide, please? Or the website, the Scholars for People website. Thank you. Yeah, so, yeah, that's the one. Please put it up there. Thanks. Okay, some of you, I'm pretty sure some or several of you very kindly made this petition the formidable weapon it was. But anyway, so briefly what happened is September 2015, the California Department of Education issued a new draft of the framework. So the framework basically means like the syllabus, because the core syllabus can only be changed through legislation. So that can't be touched right now, very complicated. Every few years they review how the syllabus is to be interpreted. So that's what the whole process and fight was all about. Anyway, so 2015 they issued a draft which had one or two token improvements in terms of Hinduism, but it was mostly still the same old bad narrative. And several of us wrote letters. I sent a letter, they didn't do much. Acharya, Arunaswamy, all these people would go every month and offer suggestions. Then in November, a group of premier scholars, the South Asia faculty group, wrote a letter with some very radical suggestions, which is actually the dominant narrative today, and I'll tell you in a minute what those suggestions were. I caution some of these other groups occasionally as and when they would, deem it fit to listen to me, or as I said, look, this is going to be a real problem, and you get an academic response organized, and various reasons, it didn't happen. Then finally in March, when they concluded the review, these guys, the IQC had a subdivision to approve the changes. They rejected like 90-95% of suggestions made by all the Indian and Hindu groups. Okay? Like there were 200-300 suggestions. And most of them are not about caste, by the way. Most of them are about including positive content, including several edits requesting that the names of non-Brahmin saints and Bhakti saints be included. Okay? All of these, they ignored. And the South Asia faculty letter, which had submitted 78 specific changes, they accepted 62. And that was a record. No other group had got, so many accepted. Then finally in March, people said, what actually happened here? What is going to happen? And it was pretty obvious that they had decided that India didn't exist. They would remove the word India. The lesson called Ancient India would be called Ancient South Asia. The word Hinduism would be eliminated altogether. It would be referred to as, the religion of ancient India. And every single point which recognized the existence of Indian continuity or civilization or Hinduism would have been eliminated, except for just, caste and so on and so forth. Before we actually look at that cartoon, it can be there. So let me give you a quick rundown of what the South Asia faculty were asking for. Okay. So this will tell you what the dominant paradigm is in academia, just the way it played out in the letter that they sent in November. Okay, the specific changes they asked for. And then you'll see why my dear friend Srinivas